In this video, we're going to go over Chapter 4 of Jennifer Saul's Lying, Misleading, and What is Said. So, Saul takes there to be two traditions about the morality of lying, two general traditions. Under the first tradition, any or all instances of deception will be considered lying, but not every instance of deception or lying is going to be morally wrong. So, in other words, under the first tradition, there is no distinction between lying and misleading, and it will turn out that some instances of lying or misleading would be deemed morally wrong, but other instances of lying or misleading will not be deemed morally wrong. On the second tradition, not all instances of deception are considered lies. So there will be a difference between, say, lying and misleading when it comes to an act of deception. But under this account, every instance of lying would be deemed morally wrong. So any lie would be deemed morally wrong under the second tradition. Now, one thing that Saul wants to highlight is that the second tradition is a bit more puzzling than the first tradition, in that what matters in the first tradition seems to be consequences and motivations. In other words, while in the first tradition there is no distinction between lying and misleading, um, we're able to make sense of why some acts of deception would be deemed morally wrong or morally right based on the motivations or consequences of the particular act. Whereas in the second tradition, that wouldn't be the case, because in the second tradition, almost by definition, lying is considered morally wrong. So it doesn't leave any room for an explanation as to why it would be morally wrong based on consequences or motivation. So this seems to be a bit puzzling for Saul. Now, one of the problems with the first tradition, however, according to Saul, is that, well, the lying and misleading distinction doesn't make any sense. Of course, it makes sense in the second tradition because, again, there could be instances of deception that aren't considered lies, namely, let's say, misleadings. But in the first tradition, there is no distinction. And this is problematic, at least at first glance, because there does seem to be a genuine difference between lying and misleading someone. So ultimately, what Saul wants to argue for is an alternative account, a third tradition. Well, it's not a third tradition, it would be just an alternative account, a third option, let's say. So what Saul believes is that both tradition 1 and tradition 2 get something right. There is something right about them, but they also get some things wrong, right? And under her alternative tradition, she essentially is going to take the benefits of tradition 1 and tradition 2 and is going to circumvent the pitfalls or the shortcomings of tradition 1 and tradition 2. What her alternative account is going to propose is that, like in the second tradition, there is a distinction between misleading and lying. So this distinction is recognized, whereas it is not recognized in the first tradition. However, it's not going to be the case that every act of misleading is going to be morally preferable to lying the way that the second tradition maintains, right? So in the first tradition, there is no distinction to be made. So it's not going to be the case that misleading is going to be preferred to lying. It's going to depend on a particular act of deception and what the motivations or consequences are going to be. That's not what is being said in the second tradition. So what Saul wants to do, right, is, again, from the second tradition, take this distinction, right? There is a distinction to be made, but from the first tradition, she wants to maintain that it's going to be something else other than the fact that by definition lying is going to be morally wrong and therefore misleading is going to be morally preferable. There are going to be other factors that are going to determine whether a specific act of misleading is going to be morally preferable to lying, or vice versa. Sometimes lying is actually going to be morally preferable to misleading. Um, Really quickly, what do we mean by moral preference here? Well, what we mean is that all acts of lying are always going to be morally worse than acts of misleading, say, according to the second tradition. And what Saul wants to argue against is the idea that lying is always going to be morally worse than misleading. She wants to argue that there are going to be times in which misleading somebody will in fact be morally worse than lying. Before we get into the reasons or the argument for this position, she wants to make a few things clear in order to better present her case, right? So one thing that she wants to make clear is the notion that a misleading, unlike the notion of lying, is considered to be a success term. What that means is that in order for somebody to mislead, you have to be successful at misleading. If you're not successful at misleading, then you haven't misled anybody. Whereas lying is not a success term in that you can attempt to lie at somebody, fail at it, like you get caught lying at somebody. And just because you failed at lying doesn't mean that you didn't lie. It just means that you're a bad liar, right? Whereas if you fail at misleading somebody, then you can't be said to successfully have misled that person because you failed at it. So that's what it means for misleading to be a success term, unlike lying. Lying, unlike misleading, must be deliberate, right? So lying is a deliberate act. You have to consciously attempt to lie to somebody, whereas misleading, you can do it accidentally just by providing, well, it need not even be false information. You can mislead somebody, and this is what Saul is going to demonstrate. You can mislead somebody by saying something truthful, right? But you just may be ignorant about all of the facts, and in communicating something to someone, you may mislead them without knowing that you did it. But you can't lie to somebody without knowing that you did it. Any act of lying is going to require that you know that you are trying to lie, that individual. So, okay, the position that Saul wants to explicitly argue against is what we'll call M. So M maintains that holding all else fixed, lying is always morally worse than merely deliberately attempting to mislead, and successful lying is morally worse than merely deliberately misleading. So how does Saul go about demonstrating that M is false? Well, she does this with two counterexamples. So the first counterexample is the Charla and Dave HIV counterexample. So Charla is a person who is HIV positive, but she does not yet have AIDS. And she knows both of these facts. Dave is about to have sex with Charla for the first time and cautiously but imprecisely asked Charla, "Do you have AIDS?" To which Charla replies, "No, I don't have AIDS." Charla and Dave proceed to have unprotected sex, and Dave becomes infected with HIV. So now, what Charla said in her response to Dave's question was in fact true, because Charla does not have AIDS. But in saying that, she misled Dave in believing perhaps that she also didn't have HIV, which then led Dave to perhaps feel more comfortable about having unprotected sex with Charla and thus becoming infected with HIV. So it is unquestionably true that Charla deceived Dave about her having HIV, but it is also unquestionably true that Charla did not lie. She didn't lie, right? She did deceive, but she didn't lie. Now, to suppose, as M maintains, that Charla's deception, right, or misleading is morally preferable to having lied seems to be outrageous, right? It seems that she did something as morally wrong as if she would have said, "No, I don't have AIDS," or "No, I don't have HIV," rather than just saying, "No, I don't have AIDS," right? So it seems that what Charla did was just as morally reprehensible, even though she said something that was true, in misleading as though she were to have lied to Dave, right? So it seems that this gives us reason to reject M. Now, the second counterexample. So in the second counterexample, you have George, who is making dinner for Frida. He knows that Frida has a peanut allergy so virulent that even a small amount of peanut oil could kill her. He wants to actually kill Frida, so he has cooked with peanut oil. Frida becomes rightly suspicious or cautious, maybe not suspicious, let's just say cautious, as to whether George has put any peanuts in the meal that he is cooking. George utters a true but misleading claim when he says, "No, I didn't put any peanuts in the meal," right? So rather than saying, "No, I didn't put any peanut products," or saying something like, "No, this meal is perfectly safe for you to eat," he instead says, "No, I didn't put any peanuts in the meal," which is true. He didn't put any peanuts. He put peanut oil in the meal, which is still going to kill Frida. So again, while he didn't lie to Frida, right? He didn't say a lie. He definitely misled her. And given the context of the situation, right, which again, if Frida goes about ingesting this meal and ultimately lead to her death, it seems that he did something just as morally wrong, if not worse, by misleading Frida rather than if he were just to have merely lied. So again, this is more evidence to suggest that M is actually false. So at this point, a defender of M may say, okay, maybe we need to like add a qualification here. Like most of what M is trying to say still holds, but obviously these counterexamples do seem to suggest some weaknesses or flaws against M. So here's a way of adjusting for it. So we could say something like MD, right? Where we make the fact that M is always morally preferable, sorry, that misleading is always morally preferable to lying defeasible. So we say, except in certain special cases, right? And then blah, 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 everything else holds. Where these two counterexamples can be considered special cases. They're the exception to the rule, right? And we could still explain as to why they are morally worse than lying. But even this seems to bring a puzzle according to Saul. There's still something puzzling about this. And the puzzle is, well, why do we still psychologically have a moral preference for misleading over lying? Now, in order to see this, let us consider the following case. So suppose that a dying woman asks if her son is okay, and you saw this woman's son the previous day, yesterday, and he was happy and he was healthy, but shortly after he was hit by a car. Well, in this case, right, if you say, I saw him yesterday and he was happy and healthy, then you're saying something true, but you know what you are getting at when you're saying that, right? You're obviously misleading this woman into believing that her son is perfectly fine. And then this is a false belief. Now, if we only have a duty to assert things that are true, why is it the case that inducing a false belief in someone is considered morally wrong? I mean, it definitely seems that it's morally wrong. But if we don't maintain that misleading can like always be, if not systematically be worse than lying, then we would never be able to explain this, right? There seems to be this puzzle here that we still find misleading morally preferable to lying, yet it seems like we can always be telling the truth, always be misleading, right? Even when we're telling the truth, and yet induce false beliefs in other individuals, which seems to be morally wrong. This is definitely morally wrong, but even the revised MD account doesn't seem to capture or explain this puzzle. The puzzle of why, even though we see in light of these counterexamples that it's not always going to be the case that deceiving is morally preferable to, or sorry, misleading is always morally preferable to lying, why is it that we still intuitively think that it is? So what Saul wants to suggest is, again, the following, right? There is a distinction to be made between misleading and lying. This distinction is real, but it's not going to be the case that one or the other is going to be morally preferable, right? So how do we assess whether a specific act of deceiving or lying is morally wrong? Well, ultimately what we're doing is we're not judging, Saul wants to say, we're not judging the individual actions. What we are doing is we're judging the character of the person who's performing these acts. It is in looking at their motivations, why they go about choosing misleading rather than lying, or lying rather than misleading in a given situation. That is what we're going to be judging. So in the case of Charla or George, they opted to mislead rather than lie because of their motivations. Okay, so that is the end of this video.